Thanks very much for having me here. Thanks for putting my paper into the conference. So the usual disclaimer applies because I'm at the San Francisco Fed. This is the paper that is joined with my long-term co-authors, Wataru at Hong Kong University and Dmitriy at Bocconi. Another disclaimer is that if I talk sometimes, gibberish, blame it on it's 3 hours of sleep, and talking at 1:30 in the morning. Okay. So the motivation of our paper is quite simple. Is that oil shock is probably one of the most prominent macro shocks that have been studied in the literature. And the question is how oil shocks propagate has been studied in the literature, in the empirics, Killian, as well as Baumeister, Hamilton, and Kanzik identify oil supply shocks and study how it affects the economy. And then in the theory, there were papers that emphasize on the supply side as well as on the demand side. And so we want to zoom into this a seminal work by Benanke and his co-author in the Brookings, where they observed, they make an observations that when oil shocks have very negative effects on the output in the economy, it often coincides with when the interest rate is high. Okay? And they show that with the VAR, they have a counterfactual where they shut down the responses of interest rate, then output did not respond as negatively. Okay? And so they argue that the large part of a decline in output due to oil shock is due to monetary policy. And so what we do in this paper is that we're going to ask the question, we're going to revisit the questions, does systematic monetary policy shocks affect oil shocks propagation? Okay? And the idea is that the zero low bound episodes are somewhat a natural test for this hypothesis because monetary policy does not react to oil shocks. Okay? And we're going to use the data for several countries that have experienced long enough zero low bound episodes. There are 3 countries that I'm going to show you the results today, which is Japan, the UK, and the US. Okay, and I'm going to emphasize the most of our results in Japan. I'm going to explain why. And then we're going to for the oil shocks identification, we're going to use the high frequency identification that is in Kanzik paper, Diego Kanzik's paper in the AER, and we're going to show how this oil supply shocks affects these countries in the zero low bound period versus in the normal times. And the bonus result is going to see where this crazy idea that higher oil price might be good for the economy, whether that is observed in the data. Okay. Okay. So the main finding in the theory, we show that in a model where oil is used as a production, then a negative oil supply shocks can be expansionary in the zero low bound when there's inflation. Okay. And in the empirical results, what we find is that a negative oil supply shocks in the zero low bound period is less contractionary than the oil supply shocks in the normal times. So in particular in Japan, an oil supply shocks that increase oil prices by 10% actually leads to a increase in industrial production by up to 1% in Japan in the zero low bound. Okay? And this result can be significant in some horizons. Okay? And this effect, actually, we also show that this effect is really dependent on the type of oil supply shocks that we use in the empirics. Okay? I'm going to skip the related literature. So just to illustrate how oil supply shocks may affect the economy differently in the zero low bound, we write down an open economy new Keynesian model with oil, and we make a lot of simple assumptions. In particular, it's about oil is only being used in the production. the setup of the economy is that the world economy is that there are two, is a small open economy model where essentially we are thinking about Japan, okay? And then there's a world economy that is endowed with oil. Oil is, again, as I said, oil is being used in the production, and there's a complete asset market, okay? And then we can solve this model by pen and pencil, and then we can write down the model for the world economy based on these four equations, okay? And it's actually quite standard equations. So the first one is the Euler equation, okay, where the star is the stars that denote foreign or world economy. The second equation is the standard the Taylor rule, where interest rate reacts to the inflation rate, okay? And the third equation is the Phillips curve. So you can see that the only thing that is different in the Phillips curve here compared to a standard three equation New Keynesian model is that RT here is the real oil price, okay? That oil price enter the Phillips curve. The reason is that oil price is being used in the production as an input, and so an increase in real oil price which increase a firm's marginal cost, and so that's why it's entered there. And the last equation is just the determinants of the real oil price, which is depending on the demand from the world demand as well as the oil supply, right? So that's very standard. The small open economy block is, I could say, relatively standard also, and it's quite intuitive. So the first equation again is the Euler equation for the small open economy. The second equation again is the Taylor rule. The third one is the Phillips curve. So what's the difference between a small open economy and the large economy, closed economy? There is that not only does oil price, real oil price entering the Phillips curve, but there's also two more terms. One is the world demand, right? And the other one is the real exchange rate. So the real exchange rate, Q, here, when Q increases, that means depreciation, okay? So it's just very intuitive. When oil prices went up, it's because oil prices are denominated in the foreign currency, and so that means that there would be an increase when there's an increase in oil price. That increased marginal cost. At the same time, what happened when oil prices go up is that there's a lower demand from the war, so that C star T is going to go down, right? And what happens to the exchange rate? Well, the real exchange rate is going to depreciate. So depending on the forces between these three, you will have an increase in marginal cost for the firms. Okay, and the fourth equation is the equation that relates, the inflation at home with the CPI with the the producer prices and the exchange rate. Okay, and the last one is just the standard, risk-sharing equation. The real exchange rate is a function of home and foreign relative consumption. Okay, because this is the complete market. Okay, so how does oil prices, the negative oil supply shocks, the increased oil prices affect the economy in the normal versus the zero bound time? Okay, so we're going to think about the model for the world economy first to get intuition. So the first one is that in a normal time, so the Euler equation is the orange line, and then the Phillips curve is upward sloping. So when there's an increase in oil prices due to a lower oil supply, that increases the firm's marginal cost. Phillips curve shift up, so you get a standard result where that there's an increase in inflation as well as a negative impact on consumption, on the real output. Okay. What's the difference if it's a zero low bound period? So the difference here is that now the Euler equation is is the same upward sloping as the Phillips curve, right? And now the difference here is that when the Phillips curve shifts up due to an increase in oil prices, as long as there's inflation, you can see that as long as there's inflation, you will have an increase an increase actually in consumption in the world economy. Okay? It's just intuitive that people expect inflation, and so with interest rate stays at 0, so you actually get a negative a decline in the real rate, and so that helps to increase consumption. What's the difference in terms of a small open economy? So the only difference here is that the Euler equation, even in the normal time, in the small open economy, is also going to shift. So why is it going to shift? The reason is the following. So you can see here is that, okay, so first we still here assume in that graph is that with an increase in oil prices, the marginal cost is going to go up, so Phillips curve is going to shift up. Okay? The Euler equation is also shifting. The reason is that there's with the oil prices increase, there's a depreciation of the exchange rate, but because this is a one-time shock, agents expect that the real exchange rate is going to appreciate. Okay? So that leads to an increase in expectation of inflation, and so that's why the Euler equation is also going to shift. So in this case, but depending on the shift of these two curves, you're going to get still a negative effect of oil supply shocks in the small open economy, even in the normal time. Right? In the zero low bound time, again, the Euler equation again is also shifting, but as long as the shift is small enough, you will see that, in this case, for example, what I plot here is that with an increase in oil price due to the negative oil supply shocks, you still can get an expansionary effect of oil supply shocks if there's inflation. Okay? So the model takeaway here is that, under some parameterization, you can get an expansionary effect of oil supply shocks if there's, again, inflation. Okay? So now I'm going to go to the empirics, which I think is the main contribution of our paper. Okay? So first of all, we want to explain how we identify oil supply shocks, and we do it in a little bit convoluted way, I guess, because there are several steps involved. Okay? So as I said at the beginning is that we try to use the high frequency identification of oil supply shocks based on Diego's paper in the ER. So what does it do? Essentially, in the first step, we extract an oil supply shocks, the similar way as Diego. So what it does is the following. We're going to do the idea is that the change in oil price futures on the day of the OPEC announcement reflects the new information about what oil supply will be. Okay, and so what we do is that we can find the first principal component of the 1 to 12 months oil price future price changes of a one-day window, the OPEC announcement day versus the day before. Then we can use this as a proxy or as an instrument in a VAR. Okay, the way that it's set up is that the high frequency oil price change is going to in daily frequency is going to be aggregated up into a monthly series. It's going to be instrumented in a proxy VAR where the war for the world oil market. So the world oil market includes 4 variables: a real oil price. Okay, world oil inventories, world oil production, and world industrial productions. Okay, then what we do is that from this proxy VAR, we extract the shocks and use it in a third steps, which is why I said it was a little bit convoluted. So what is the third step? The third step is a local projection, a state-dependent local projection. Okay, so what do we do here is that on the left-hand side is the variable of interest, Y, for example, industrial production and CPI, and on the right-hand side we have a state-dependent where I here is the indicator whether the economy is in the zero low bound or not. Okay, and so we can think about this is that we are regressing, say, industrial production on the identified shocks from the second step. And we control for, the left-hand side variable, lags, and lags of the shocks, lags of unemployment. Actually, we control for a host of things at our robustness check. Okay, so the coefficient on the shocks, the beta there, will tell us what's the effect of these oil price shocks on the economy in the zero low bound versus in the normal time. Okay, and we use 12 lags in all of the control. All right. We want to use the data, as I said, is that we use the data for 3 main countries in the paper, Japan, US, and the UK. So why do we focus so much on the Japan? So Japan turns out to have the longest zero low bound, right, compared to any other countries in the world. In fact, we find that Japan has a zero low bound period from 1995 to about 2006, and then 2009 to 2019. So that's one thing. So Japan has the longest zero low bound period. The second thing is that Japan is consistently an oil importer. I can use the US results, but at the same time, the US, one concern about the US, for example, is that US was an oil importer before, but now it's more like an oil exporter. So it's harder for us to say whether the result we say that we find comes from whether it's the monetary policy channel or is it oil importer or exporter change, right? And then the UK has a shortest zero low bound period, and it also changed from being an oil exporter to an oil importer, okay? We're going to define the zero low bound period is when the nominal interest rate falls below 0.5%, okay? There's some caveat that we want to say here is that there are unconventional monetary policy that can move long-term long rate and potentially undo the zero low bound. So we're going to examine how this long-term rate, the 5 years rate, responds to this oil supply shocks even in the zero low bound. Okay, so now let me give you the result for Japan. So as I said, Japan has the longest zero low bound period. Actually, it's from 1995 to about 2006, and then it tries to raise the rate, and then somehow the Great Recession hit, it goes down to 0. And so we have this 2 period of the zero low bound. And so this is the first result. Okay, the first result shows you the real variable response in Japan. So on the left-hand side is the response of the industrial production, and on the right-hand side is the unemployment rate. Okay, so in each graph, you see there are 2 lines, 2 colors. The blue ones are the responses in the zero low bound, and the gray one is in the normal time. Okay, and the confidence band here is the 68%. So we actually test the differences between these two, formally in the paper. But here you can see here is that, industrial production in Japan declined in the normal time, especially after a few months, 6 months, while it increases in the zero low bound. Okay, and the unemployment rate is also the response is essentially the mirror image. Unemployment rate goes down in the zero low bound compared to the normal time, which is kind of close to 0, or increases a little bit. Okay, so that's the Japan result. We also looks at the real variable in the quarterly frequency, where we aggregate them in based on quarters. And you can see here is that I've showed you the real GDP per capita, consumption, investment, and government spending. And you can see here again that it shows the same pattern that the oil supply shock is less contractionary in the zero low bound than in the normal time. What about the mechanism that we've been talking about, which is how the nominal variables and inflation expectation moves in Japan? So the 4 plots here that I showed you is the short-term nominal interest rate. That's the top left, and then the 5 years rate, as well as the inflation expectation by the professional forecasters in Japan, as well as the CPI inflation. So you can see here that in the normal times, nominal interest rate goes up in Japan, stays close to 0 in the zero low bound, and the 5 years rate seem to be agreeing with that, having that same pattern. Inflation expectation increases in the zero low bound, one thing that we have to, it's puzzling for us, and it doesn't fit into the whole story here, is that the actual inflation that you observe is that it increases in the normal time, but it's close to 0 in the ZLB. Okay. Does this pattern get explained by oil prices responses differently? The answer is no, because as you can see here is that the responses of real oil price in the zero low bound and normal times are not that different from each other. Okay, what about other countries? So here I'm showing you the real variables responses, again, industrial production and unemployment rate in the second panel for the US and for the UK. So again, it's consistent with our observation in Japan that oil supply shock is less contractionary in the zero low bound versus in the normal time. Is it consistent in terms of the story, how the nominal interest rate responds as well? So here I showed you the short-term nominal interest rate response in the US and the UK on the top, and in the lower panel is the 5 years responses. So this is different from Japan. As you can see here is that the 5 years rate response, there's no differences in between the zero bound and the normal time in the US and the UK. What about the inflation expectations? So I showed you that in both cases they are not different from each other. But the pattern that you saw here is that the short-term rate responds more in the normal time in the zero low bound time compared to the zero low bound time. So it's consistent with the the story in the model. Okay. So we do a lot of analysis, but we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to skip this. And going to this part of the paper where we say, okay, why do we find that oil supply shocks is less contractionary in the zero low bound versus normal time? And there are other oil supply shocks that are identified in the literature, and we want to see, okay, does this really depend a lot on the shocks that is identified? So we look at 2 different oil supply shocks identified in the literature. One is Killian in 2009 AER, where he identified this oil supply shock as essentially it's a Kolesky identification where oil supply curve is oil supply does not respond to oil prices, and other conditions. Okay. And in this case, and this is actually consistent with what Johannes Willens find in his JPE paper, that if I use this shock for Japan in the zero low bound versus in the normal times, you don't see any difference. Okay? And why is that the case? So one explanation that I can provide, or at least intuitively for me, is that these oil supply shocks is not important for real oil price. Okay? So here I plot for you this real oil price response to Killian oil supply shocks. There's not much effect, and that's actually what he said in the paper too. So in the model, where theoretically, if the oil supply shocks affect the small open economy, through this oil price movement, and if oil price, doesn't really change due to this oil supply shocks in Killian, then intuitively to me that it makes sense that you don't see the difference, right? What about, I'm going to skip that one, and what about Baumeister-Hamilton shocks? So Baumeister-Hamilton shock says, wait a minute, Killian had this strong assumption that the elasticity of oil supply is 0, so they're going to say, I'm not going to impose that, okay? And I'm going to try to identify that in my VAR. And in this case, they find that oil supply shock is more important for oil prices. As you can see for the the impulse response I plot here, the oil prices respond a lot strongly and more significantly to this Baumeister-Hamilton oil supply shocks. And then in this case, what we see in Japan is that it's somewhat in between our very strong result versus Killian. That is, there is some responses that there are some differences between the response in Japan in the zero low bound versus in the normal time. Right? So oil supply shocks are not as contractionary. Okay. We do a lot more analysis, but I'm going to run out of time in like 15 seconds. So I'm going to conclude here that we use this in our paper. We try to understand where the oil supply shocks can be less contractionary or even expansionary in the zero lower bound, and we find that evidence in Japan, in the US, and in the UK. And we've also found that interest rate is less, interest rates and inflation expectation response consistent with the New Keynesian mechanism. And there is an evidence that oil supply shocks can be expansionary. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks to the organizer for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. So this paper provides novel evidence and thought-provoking evidence that negative supply shocks, so oil price increases, can actually be expansionary whenever the central bank are unable to adjust their short-term rates because the zero lower bound becomes binding. So they show strong evidence for Japan, but they also provide evidence for the United States and the United Kingdom. As this picture shows, on the left panel, we see that this is scaled by a 10% increase in oil prices. A 10% increase in oil prices leads to a 1% increase in output during the ZLB at about a 1-year horizon. This is not only a statistically significant result, it is also economically relevant result. So this, of course, opens up a series of questions about policy implications. As the paper is showing, this mechanism, the fact that oil shocks, negative oil shocks could be expansionary, is consistent with the predictions of the standard New Keynesian model in closed economy or an open economy. And the idea is very simple. There is an increase in oil prices. The nominal interest rate cannot be adjusted. Inflation expectations go up. And as a result, the real rate is lower. This lower real rate is what is stimulating the economy. Output is going up. The paper contains an exhaustive set of robustness checks, especially for Japan, that, in my opinion, is convincing that this mechanism could be at work in reality. And for this reason, I will focus my discussion not, there are very few questions that are left after you read a 50-page appendix with all the robustness checks. I will come back later. There are possible some questions to be raised regarding the evidence on the US, but most of my discussion will be focused on discussing the results of the paper in the context of the literature and the policy implications. So let's get started. So, of course, there are many papers looking at the effects of a variety of shocks during the zero lower bound episodes. The result of this paper are consistent with previous studies looking at the effects of other shocks in Japan. For instance, the work by a joint team of people at the Bank of Japan and the University of Oxford, Ikeda et al., shows that, in fact, demand shock seems to transmit differently to the economy during the ZLB in Japan. However, as it was mentioned earlier, this result is in sharp contrast with previous evidence on the effect of supply shocks, for instance, by Johannes Wieland in his, what was his job market paper published in the JP in 2019. And the main difference as well is that Johannes Wieland uses both earthquakes as an exogenous measure of shocks and oil shocks identified using the methodology of Killian, while this paper looks at a different identification scheme by Diego Kenzig, and find an opposite result. Now, the paper is very transparent. It illustrates that the results depend on the identification strategy. What to me is still an open question is, even though the paper mentions that the Killian shocks have less predictive power about movements in oil prices, still this does not explain why the two shocks imply a different correlation in the response of measures of economic activity. This is about power, but why a different correlation? Is it because perhaps the different shocks are contaminated with different measures are contaminated with different type of other shocks? This, I think, it will be nice to clarify. For the United States, there are other studies that have looked at similar questions and proposing what is the so-called irrelevance hypothesis or empirical irrelevance hypothesis of the zero lower bound, like the work by Eric Swanson and John Williams, or my own work with Jordi Galli and Luca Gambetti. So what is the idea there is that arguably because the central bank was able to implement unconventional monetary policies, it was able to get around the constraints imposed by a binding zero lower bound. Here the main difference relative to those studies is that the focus is on oil shocks, while those studies use different methodologies and look at other shocks. So my first comment is, okay, so let's try to think about what we can really learn from oil shocks relative to what people have documented using different shocks. And to do so, let me take a simple look at the data in a broader way. So if we entertain the hypothesis that the central bank is unable to respond to oil shocks during ZLB episodes, it should also be the case that overall macroeconomic volatility increases because the central bank is not able to stabilize the economy. Is it the case? Well, here I just show you two figures. This is the time series of industrial production in the top panel and in inflation in the bottom panel. And shaded areas represent the ZLB periods. As to a naked eye, we cannot see an increase in volatility during the ZLB period, and the same holds for Japan. For the United States. So if we formally test this hypothesis, we can calculate the relative volatility of industrial production and inflation in the ZLB period relative to the full sample, or the non-ZLB period. Regardless of how we do it, we find that there is no evidence of an increase in volatility. All these numbers in this table are close or below 1, suggesting there is no increase in overall macroeconomic volatility during the ZLB period. So what's going on? How can we reconcile these findings? Well, there are two options. One is good luck, in the sense that oil shocks didn't materialize during the ZLB period, or perhaps they were just offsetting negative demand shocks, and as a result, we don't see an increase in overall economic volatility. The alternative hypothesis is that there are good policies, as I've already mentioned, that the central bank was able to get rid or get around the constraint imposed by the zero lower bound. But if that is the case, then why it was not able to stabilize oil shocks as it does during normal times? Well, perhaps because forward guidance, or QE, is a good policy to stimulate economic activity, but if we receive a bad supply shock, then we cannot really implement a negative forward guidance or a negative QE. Or it could actually be the optimal response. If we look at theories looking at what is the optimal monetary policy at the ZLB, we can actually have that looking through supply shock is actually optimal. Well, but then is an open question is, well, if it is really good policy, we should observe an asymmetric response of supply shocks depending on whether it is a positive or a negative shock. And this is perhaps an hypothesis that can be tested in future work. The second comment is about the mechanism. As it was partly mentioned during the presentation, the mechanism, the increase in oil prices that leads to a reduction in the real interest rate, finds some support for the Japan, but not really for the US. If you look at the two graphs on the left here, we see that the 5-year nominal bond yield show no difference in the responses during normal time and then in the ZLB. And inflation expectation, if anything, respond less during the ZLB, the blue line. So this suggests that the real rate is not going down in the US during the zero lower bound, thus invalidating or calling into question the mechanism proposed in the paper, or the new Keynesian theory more broadly. Then the third comment is about some methodology. This is not a criticism of this paper. It more broadly applies to the whole literature, looking at state-dependent or non-linear effects of different type of shocks. The typical methodology is to use a first step where we have a linear setting to identify the shock. And then we combine this linear setting into a non-linear model. This is clearly an inconsistency because somehow if the data generated process is nonlinear, then the first step is not consistent with our running hypothesis. In a recent paper of mine with Mario Forni, Luca Gambetti, and Luca Sala, we propose a way to clearly establish what assumptions need to be satisfied for the first step to be consistent with the second nonlinear step, and an econometric test that we call informational sufficiency test. But why why, just to give you an idea whether this could be a problem in this current paper, here you have the distribution of shocks across the two samples. The yellow is the normal time, and the green is the ZLB. We see that the distribution is not the same. The distribution of oil shocks in the ZLB period has a positive mean and a larger variance. So this suggests that perhaps the shocks in the in the ZLB sample for the US could perhaps be contaminated with other shocks, even though this is not approved, but it could be tested. So to conclude, this paper provides novel and striking evidence that oil shocks could be expansionary at the zero lower bound. And the mechanism seems highly robust, especially for the Japanese experience pre-2008. And this raises a series of questions. Well, should we worry about it, since at the end of the day, these oil shocks doesn't seem to change the overall macro volatility? But more interestingly, beyond the zero lower bound episodes, is a question I raised to the author and to the audience. If we look at the current situation, we have tensions in the Middle East that generated high increases in oil prices. At the same time, we have pressures on central bank not to raise interest rates. Is this an unconventional way to provide an economic stimulus? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Davide. So, would you like to respond before we collect questions again?
Yeah, so thanks so much, David, for the great discussion. And it raises a lot of interesting points. So I want to address from the last comment to the first one. So the last comment about like the methodology that we estimate the shocks in a linear VAR, and then we have a state-dependent local projection. So in an ideal world, I guess, we would want to have everything estimated in one system, right? Like in the VAR, where you have the US or in Japan, as well as the world oil prices, and then you have a state dependent. But especially for the US, the ZLB, even though we think that it's pretty long, but once you do that in the VAR, where you have 12 lags, you just don't get anything that is making sense, because the ZLB period is pretty short. And so for Japan, we did that in one of our robustness check, but for the US, we didn't. But one thing that we did also is that we try to we say let's ignore the fact that this nonlinear VAR is going to be having a lot of errors, and so what we do is we extracted we make a proxy VAR state dependent based on the US ZLB. We extracted the shock, and then we do a local projection. So we actually see the same, similar results as what we have. The only thing, again, as I said, is I don't like that, and it didn't go even to the 50-page appendix, is that because, I don't believe that the state-dependent VAR is really, making a lot of sense. The second thing about the 5 years rate responses, so we understand, that there is some worry that, there's an unconventional monetary policy that's going on, especially in the US and the UK, and so that's why we get this result instead of, the standard New Keynesian mechanism that we suggest in the paper. So what we did is that we did two things. So one is that we look at the responses where we control for the 5-year rate responses, as well as a shadow rate into the regressions. We see that for the US and the UK, the differences in the zero bound and the normal time shrinks, but you still see that it's less contractionary. Okay, so I guess what I showed you in the presentation is really just it's probably the combination of the New Keynesian mechanism as well as this unconventional monetary policy. The second thing is to look at the shadow rate response. For the shadow rate response, it really depends on whether we look at the Wu and Xia's shadow rate versus the Krippner's shadow rate. If you look at the Krippner shadow rates responses, we don't see that it's significantly declined. So the last one, in terms, which is the first comment about the macro volatility. I guess, here is an open question. I guess what we see is that the unconditional, as Davide was saying, is that it's an unconditional moments in the data. You don't see the increase in macro volatility. For the inflation rate, there's a lot of theory why you don't see an increase in macro volatility. So I guess one theory that my co-author likes to push on us is that his paper with jury, explained this low volatility of inflation in the other periods that people don't expect negative inflation. Okay, and then for the for output, there's maybe a good policy. There may be other shocks, and I want to plug our paper for the other types of shocks like government spending for Japan. Also, the response in the zero bound versus normal times are also different. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we collect questions. We start here.
Gernot Müller, University of Tübingen. So I think this is a very interesting paper with provoking results, but I wonder, do you have anything to say about current developments after all these oil price shocks are back, and central banks, in particular here at the ECB, I understand, have always discussed of whether to look through these oil price shocks to the extent that they are temporary. This was, I think, in April still, no policy response. Yeah. So, I mean, is that result from the zero low bound somewhat informative about what happens if you look through these policy shocks?
Yeah, Martin Bodenstein, Federal Reserve Board. So I had the honor to discuss this paper about 4 years ago, I think, at a smaller conference within the Federal Reserve System. And so it's nice to see how the paper has evolved. And I think Davide's discussion was probably deeper than mine. So congratulations also to the discussant. Well, Gernot partly got to my question already. Is there some way, basically, of trying to identify episodes when central bank languages have been so that one may accommodate a policy, or one may start to look through the shock? I think that's sort of just generally, it would also, I guess, broaden the set of policy experiments one can have. But I think one point that rose back then was to what extent, if I look at Japan as a small open economy that's an oil importing country, to what extent can you just do oil price as exogenous drivers of it? And does it really matter whether you have identified the oil price shocks or not? Thanks.
Okay. Oh.
Okay, let's just see.
Keith, yeah, go ahead.
Keith Küster, University of Bonn. So also about the current environment to some extent. Now, my interpretation of the impulse responses that you show is that not responding to these shocks to monetary policy buys you quite a bit on the output side. You avoid a deep recession, and there's a little inflation response. Now, my question is on the trade-offs in different environments, and that goes as much to the theory, I think. How does this result depend on the persistence of the supply disruption?
Okay. Daniel here. Oh. Okay, so Daniel, and then we go on that side.
That's a lot of questions. Okay.
Is the microphone?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so I think the methodology used here for identification is really quite clever in that you're exploiting this period where monetary policy can't respond or chooses not to respond effectively to the oil price changes. But I think I agree with Davide's point that there's something different potentially about the fact that it's a zero lower bound period. Perhaps this is a different configuration of other shocks, different dynamics may be in play in the economy at this time. So that makes me think about alternative methodologies here. And I'm curious if you've thought about using something like the McKay-Wolf methodology to implement a counterfactual policy rule, because that seems like something that's tailor-made for the sort of research question in this paper.
Okay, wait.
Work? Yeah. Maybe you have it in this 50 pages appendix when you did have time. But so I wonder about the mechanism. So you have local projection. You can look at consumption response, investment response, or other kind of responses. And that actually speaks to a lot of the question that rises here, because about the looking through debate. It's all about, if you think about consumption investment, about the long-term rate that you don't have it in your model. So it's about long-term inflation expectations. If these do not move, the mechanism is not there, and therefore consumption should not respond. So I wonder if you have looked at that or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we quickly?
Okay, so I'm just going to be
maybe
quickly.
conclude
Yeah.
the
So
break.
thanks for all the questions. So for our current situation, well, I was doing oil, right? So I had to do a briefing. The only thing I can say is that, even when I was trying to look at, let's say the euro area responses to oil supply shocks, and then, I don't look at the zero low bound versus not, I see that there's a decline in say, industrial production, but also, an increase in oil, in interest rates. So it's somewhat, again, consistent with our idea versus if I look at other countries, say, Canada or Norway, I see that the responses of industrial production is actually less, less negative. But at the same time, the interest rate is also, not increasing compared to the euro area. So, I was surprised that, somehow this story works for other countries. In terms of our methodology, we did think about use, Wolf and Mackay, but at the same time, I think the difficult part about it is that you have to, at least in the US, maybe it's possible, but in Japan, you have to look at, you have to construct, different monetary policy shocks, right? The response to the monetary policy shocks, the surprise and as well as news, and so that's why we didn't do it for Japan. And maybe, it may be a different paper. And then, so the other thing, the one last thing is that we did do a robustness check where we say, okay, let's just forget about, oil supply shocks, and especially Japan is a small open economy. Actually, what matters is the increase in oil prices, is whether it's oil supply or demand shocks. We find that in that case, it's exactly, what we find also is that, the supply oil, the shocks that increase oil prices could also lead to a differential responses in the zero low bound versus normal time. Okay? And that actually is also, again, consistent. There was a question about whether we are identifying different oil supply shocks in Killian versus in Diego Kanzik's paper. Yeah, it might be a different one, but I can say that, for example, in Killian, if we forget about his oil supply shocks, and we look at the third shock, which is called, he likes to call it a precautionary oil demand shocks, right? It's independent, it's orthogonal to the war demand shocks. Then in that case, we see the differences in the responses of Japan in the zero low bound versus normal time. Okay. But thanks very much.
Very good. Thanks again to all presenters and discussants.